Good morning and welcome to our Family Voice Zoom this morning. My name's Andrew McColl. I'm the Queensland Director of Family Voice. And our subject today is when feminism turns toxic. This is a different kind of Family Voice Zoom. Why did we choose to do this? Because it's important to deal with a matter which is often left under the carpet but should be faced up to. And that is whether it's important that positions of power are used justly and responsibly, whether it is men in those positions or women. Dr Fiona Girkin, the PhD, is a specialist in the dark traits of females and a researcher in female psychopathic behaviour. She is passionate about protecting women and men who have been or are the target of females with dark personalities. Dr. Fiona works with people who have been tangled in a web of bad behaviour by the women in their life. Dr. Fiona provides resources, training and problem-solving strategies to escape and manage dark personalities in women. Dr. Girkin, welcome to our Family Voice Zoom this morning.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I've got some questions to put to Dr. Girkin, and if these questions and her answers prompt you to ask her a question, you may wish to click on the Q&A button on your screen, and my colleague Daryl Budge from Perth will be able to moderate those to put to Fiona later in our session. Dr. Girkin, you've described yourself as having a passion to help people better understand females who use bad behaviour. What series of events led you to this?
That's a really interesting question. And I think the main point where things kind of started for me was I was in an organisation that was completely run by women, and I was having a very, very bad experience to the point where I was questioning my own abilities and behaviours. And I remember I was listening to a book one day called The Wisdom of Psychopaths by Kevin Dutton, and I watch a bit of true crime, and I always thought a psychopath was someone who was a serial killer and had bodies in their basement. But what this guy talked about was about the corporate psychopath. And he talked about the fact that psychopaths can function in everyday life. And for me, it was a really light bulb moment, because I realized that there was one woman in particular that was definitely fit the category of the female psychopath. And I started having more conversations with other people who had worked in this area and who had seen this same kind of behaviour from either the same woman or other women. And I started to learn a lot more about this, that this was a really, really big issue for people, and that it was causing so much grief and mental health issues to the point where some people would never work again as a result. And it really prompted me to want to do more.
Right, good. You've also claimed that, quote, I'm not a feminist, and that, quote, assumptions about who is the offender and who is the victim should not be based on the genitals you have. Has feminism led to this, and have unproven accusations become a greater community problem in recent years?
Yeah, look, I think years ago I used to call myself a feminist, and that's changed because I've seen feminism turn into something quite dangerous and quite toxic. I've seen it become us against them kind of attitude. I've seen it become a man-hating culture where it's not about empowering women, it's about putting men down, but it's also about taking women down that don't agree with them. So I think feminism has contributed immensely to the situation that we're in now. That comment that I made really related to domestic violence. So I used to teach domestic violence, and I used to teach police about domestic violence. And I did that from the perspective of, these are the facts and research around domestic violence, but we also need to consider that domestic violence can be caused by either party, or it can be bi-directional. Both parties can contribute. And there's quite a bit of evidence that supports that narrative. And I spoke about that publicly, and in that case, the feminists did come for me, which has now led to me working for myself. So feminism has created this real toxic, I need to take you down kind of mentality. So what's led to those false allegations? I think some of the thing with the women's movement, and when it started, it was so important that women were very oppressed in many ways. They weren't able to vote. They had no say in the home. In terms of the man kind of ruled the home in many ways. They weren't allowed to work. And as we've given women more rights, which has just been a fabulous thing that we've done, what we've done is I think we've actually gone too far, to the point we've given women so many rights that now there's tons of jobs out there that are just for women, but there's no jobs out there just for men. There's tons of scholarships for women in leadership. There's tons of scholarships for women in different areas, but men don't get that same support. So I think there's a real sense of empowering women to the point where women have almost, not all women, a very small portion of women, I'm talking about 1 in 100, in some cases, that they've just become almost narcissistic, in the sense that they've just felt the power of being a woman and to be able to do and say whatever they like, and they will always be believed. And that's where those false allegation issues come in, I believe. I think there has been an increase because I think women have watched other women who have falsely accused someone reap benefits of that. So I think when people are rewarded for lying and bad behavior, other women who are potentially of that same mindset and have those dark personalities, they'll follow suit because they think they can get something out of it. And I think that's a massive problem because there's no repercussions either for someone who makes a false allegation. And I think things won't change until there is repercussions for false allegations.
Two pieces of research that you've been involved in entitled, quote, "The Masked Prevalence and Cost of Working with Female Primary Psychopaths in the Community Service Sector," unquote, in 2024, and, quote, "The Hidden Cost of Female Psychopathic Behaviour, a case study of Tasmanian welfare organisations in 2025, raised some very disturbing issues about how government departments can be run when led by staff with destructive and self-serving agendas. What have been the consequences of this?
Yeah, so that first article that you mentioned, that's actually my PhD, and the second one is an article based on the specific work that I did, where I interviewed a number of people in the Tasmanian welfare sector. Now, I was interviewing people that, when I say welfare sector, I mean the community services sector. So I talked to social workers, people that worked in helping fields, support fields, and all these services are pretty much 80% women or more. What I saw was that there were high turnovers of staff, there was low staff morale, low productivity. There was a real toxic culture. It was as though it only took one person in an organisation of 300 to start a chain of events that caused toxic behaviour in others. So people would either side and become friends with the psychopath and band with them and contribute to the bad behaviour. And there was others that were taken down by these people through their bad behaviour. And this led to them. I mean, the amount of people that said to me they would sit in their cars before they went into the office of a morning crying, and they'd do the same when they left the office, was incredible. There was that many people that would do that. There was a number of people that were extremely suicidal as a result of the bullying behaviour that occurred within organisations that really isolated women that were targets and really left them feeling worthless. Many women left their jobs as a result of working with a psychopathic person, and a lot of them didn't have jobs to go to. So a lot of them were left, financially distraught. And those that weren't left, that tried to take on the psychopath in the workplace, were often taken down as the bully. And this is a really common thing we see, because what happens is a psychopath is someone who's very calm and collected and comes across as someone quite intelligent. So they're easy to believe because they're so likable and they're so convincing. Whereas someone who's been bullied often gets to the point where they get really frustrated and they start almost becoming the person that's raising their voice, that's getting aggravated, that's not doing the work. So the organization, instead of dealing with the person that's the puppet in this situation, manipulating the target of the bullying, they end up going after the bully themselves and go, well, hang on a minute, you're the one behaving badly. You're the one that's, yelling and screaming or not doing the work that needs to be done. Maybe just focus on your own work. And what happens is that these victims of the workplace often feel just completely isolated and feel like their organisation doesn't care. And I'm yet to find an organisation that has been very good at dealing with this behaviour. I think organisations and businesses will often prioritise someone who is worthy to the organisation, and a psychopath will always make themselves a person of value in an organisation. So what happens is the organisation never wants to get rid of them. And the other thing they do is they end up banding together with people in the organisation that they know will protect them, the CEO, deputy CEO, board members. That seems to be something that's really effective that they use. But I think the key thing that it causes for people that interact with these people is it can be career destroying. It can destroy your mental health. It can, ruin you financially and just leaving you with lifelong trauma as a result. And that was certainly something that I witnessed through my studies, but also with clients that I talk to. I mean, many of my clients no longer work with the person that bullied them, but they are still having long-term effects. They no longer trust people in the workplace. But yeah, it's a very tough situation to be in.
I came across an article in the Australian on the 18th of October by Gemma Tognini, which she wrote, called The Wrong Kind of Woman, where she wrote, no one takes down women like ladies on the political left. It's a special kind of savagery that I've seen time and again in my nearly 35 years in corporate life and on the fringes of politics. The same rules don't apply. Some women are collateral damage, the wrong kind of women. It's the kind of warped, inexplicable thinking that seeks to exclude, that in the face of appalling behaviour, one woman to another looks the other way instead of standing up and screaming no. So what has this led to in practice?
Yeah, and this writer certainly says it exactly how it is that what happens is women expect other women to support them. We have this real sense as women of sisterhood, and that women will band together and help each other and support each other. But what most women find is that that's not always the case. Most women do support each other, but you only need one to derail that sisterhood. And it's that idea of sisterhood that someone who is toxic will use against you as well, saying, "Oh well, why aren't you supporting me as your female colleague?" So that's often used against people. We often see that female psychopaths are promoted over someone who is not a psychopath because they're able to convince people that they're better for the job. And what the psychopath or the toxic person will often do is they'll try and reduce the standing of other people around them so they look better. Instead of improving themselves and working on their own behavior and supporting people, they actually work on reducing other people's social capital and social standing in an organization or in a business, because that allows them to rise and allow the other person to feel so worthless that they don't even try anymore. And I've seen that happen on a number of occasions. Um, yeah, so I think the key thing is that, most women are wonderful, nice, supportive of each other, but it only takes one to really derail that situation. Which is the biggest issue, is that we rely as women, we rely on those relationships and that sisterhood, and we don't always get that back.
You referred to the fact that some women will deride or demean other women for the sake of their own position. So, and I understand that. What do you think are the common tactics that feminists use to attack their opponents, and why have they been so successful?
Yeah, one of the key ones is relational aggression. So it's reputational savagery is another word for it. I think Jordan Peterson uses that term. And what that means is that means taking someone's social position in a social group, in the family, in a workplace, and reducing their social capital. So, for example, if someone is, well liked in the workplace, everyone likes them, they get awards for things, they get praise from the boss. Someone who is psychopathic might see that as a threat. Women believe that there's minimal resources for women, so I have to remove this woman who is a threat to my position of being liked. So I might start spreading rumors about her, saying, "Oh, I saw her leave the other day with, a pile of post-it notes," or "I saw her take money out of the petty cash," or "Oh, she was telling me that you were this or you were that." So spreading those rumors, making out the person is saying nasty things about others, maybe that they're taking things from the workplace, maybe that they don't know what they're doing. That is one of the tactics that they'll use, and they'll do that covertly through other women. The other thing they use is what's called gaslighting. Now, gaslighting is where women are convinced that they basically convinced they're going crazy, so that they don't know something or they don't know how to do something. So someone that uses gaslighting will continue to undermine the person that is the victim, and they might convince them that they're not doing a very good job, or give backhanded comments. They might go, "Oh, so you're doing that report? Oh, yeah, I didn't think you had those skills to do that. Oh, but I'm sure you can learn." So things that make people not trust themselves and doubt their own skills. And that's very clever. If someone starts telling you you can't do something multiple times, you start to believe it. And that's a really interesting tactic that they definitely use.
Just in the last few years, there have been some occasions in our parliament, the federal parliament, of females making massive allegations while seeming to misuse their position to abuse or slander some others. Have you witnessed this as well?
Yes. And there's a great saying that I use quite a lot, and I believe it was Abraham Lincoln that said it. And he says, "If you want to see someone's true colors, give them power." And I think at the time he was talking about men. If you want to give men, you see what a man's really like, give him power. But I think we're seeing the same with women. And when women are in the political sphere, they get power. They get a lot of power. And I think many of them use that to control other women, but to be nasty to other women quite publicly and not care that they've done that because they believe that they're right. And that is, yeah, definitely. There's some things I've watched recently, especially around Linda Reynolds, who went through a defamation case. That was some really nasty stuff, the way the women spoke to her in the parliament. And it was a really, really sad case in that, she was basically put on up against the media, and basically everyone believed that she had lied about the rape of Brittany Higgins and that she didn't support a woman who'd potentially been sexually assaulted, and everyone hung her out to dry. And it's such a sad case, and I'm so pleased she won that defamation, because I think it's disgusting behavior to take a woman down like that. I mean, there's nothing worse than another woman telling you that you didn't help someone that had been raped. So yeah, it's a really, really not a very good indication of what you're saying about that political sphere and them just taking other women down.
Do you think that there's been a march through the institutions in favour of women's rights to such a degree that justice has been subverted to gratify some feminist obsessions?
Yes, definitely. I've been listening to a woman recently by the name of Helen Andrews. She's a commentator and author, and she wrote a piece called "The Great Feminization." It's online if anyone would like to read it, if you just search "The Great Feminization." And she talks about the fact that she believes that society has changed quite extensively because of this feminization of society, because men and women have different ways of working. So women care more about justice, and they care more about people agreeing with them, whereas men focus more on reconciliation and the truth. Whereas women's, and that's where you see in the feminist groups, it's like the domestic violence space that I talked about, is that they care more about continuing to push the agenda than the actual facts behind what's really happening in the domestic violence space. So because of that feminization, what you're seeing is that people care less about the truth and more about hurting someone's feelings. There was a study that I think she referenced that said that 71% of men agree that free speech is important, even if it offends somebody, whereas 41% of women only said that free speech is important if it offends somebody. So women care more about someone being offended than the actual truth itself. So that's a massive issue. But yeah, she's an interesting person to listen to. I guess one of the key things is when you think about, certainly the studies I've done around toxic women and psychopathic women, women use more covert tactics and relational tactics, so relationships, whereas men are more open, they do more open contest. So they're more likely to say, yeah, hang on a minute, I'm not okay with that. Let's talk about it. Let's resolve this. Whereas a woman's more likely to go and tell someone else and start rumors about the situation. So I think it's that feminization that stopped people from talking and dealing with getting good outcomes, but instead trying to take people down that don't agree with them.
We see some biblical cases where females misuse their authority to abuse or oppress others, such as Jezebel, Athaliah, and Herodias, being just some of those. What steps can we take to prevent or confront male or female abuse of power in the family, in the workplace, in the neighbourhood, in the church, or in government?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll talk about prevention first. And I guess one of the key things with prevention is if you're in a position of power in an organization, in a business, in the family, it's important to call people out on their behavior. It's important not allow people who behave badly to get away with what they've done, because what I find is that when people get away with something, they're more likely to do it again.
Right,
If they're taken to task, then they're less likely to do it. I think it's about looking at what people say and do as two different things. Sometimes people might say something, but what they do is very different. So having a look at their actions rather than just their words. It's a bit like charity. Someone might say, "Oh, I gave money to charity," but they may not have done it. So it's just words. So sometimes it's about looking at the actual behavior and what they're actually doing. I always like to look at too what people are saying about others. How people talk about others to you is a really good indication sometimes of how they might talk about you behind your back. So that's a
right.
good indicator of whether they might be someone that is constantly looking for faults in people. People who are quite toxic are also not great at self-reflection. They're always blaming someone else for their problems. They're never taking that on themselves. They're never looking for the silver lining. So they're always blaming others for the shitty things in their life or what's happening. So there's some key things to really look out for, I think. And certainly from a business perspective in an organization, it's about having really good policies and procedures that people can follow if they do need to make a complaint. Confrontation is an interesting one because I've seen people that's worked well for and others that it hasn't. I think you need to go into confrontation with an idea of what you want out of it,
Right.
because the high level psychopathic types are not able to self-reflect. So to actually try and address some of their bad behavior with them can lead to you turning out to be the bad guy. Oh, I'm feeling attacked. I'm feeling victimized. Why would you say that to me? That's really horrible. I've heard stories from people where the psychopath would sit there and just cry and apologize, but there was no emotion behind it. It was just all performative. So making out that they knew that their behavior was, they didn't realize their behavior was bad and they would change things. And often they might say that initially, but things may not change. So that's always a difficult one. I think in the terms of like workplaces, I think it's important to report bad behavior to managers and to HR. But I also tell people, make sure you're making good notes, making sure that you keep a diary, even if it's a written diary with dates and times of things and interactions that you've had that concern you, especially those interactions where you've heard lies. So you find someone spreading a rumor about you, or you've heard a lie about somebody else. I think they're good things to keep track of. If you're concerned, it's really good idea to do that. And I find myself in workplaces now, ever since I've had these experiences, that I don't trust as well. So often, if I see anything of any minor issue, I might just start making notes that I may not need and I may not continue with, but just in case I need to refer to it later. And I think that's really important. But I think it also helps you know when someone is gaslighting you, and if you've done something and something's gone well and they try to tell you that it hasn't, I think it's a way of you looking back over and going, hang on a minute, that's not right. I'm actually right. They were just trying to make me feel bad about myself. So I think those are some key things that people can definitely do.
Do you think that this attitude of gaslighting, etc., do you think that there are some feminists who have wanted to intimidate as part of their tactics?
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I think intimidation is definitely a tactic that they use. I think that intimidation is a way of getting people to back off. I've seen many hardcore feminists, and again, not all feminists, just like not all women, but these hardcore feminists get to the point where they will actually make death threats to people if they don't like what they say. And you see a lot of that online. I know the woman Erin Peasy, I think her name is. She started the first women's shelter in the UK, and she grew up in quite an abusive household. But her mother was more abusive than her father, but both parents were quite abusive. So she started a shelter for women back in the 70s, and it was the first women's shelter. And what she found very quickly was that women that were coming to her shelter for support were just as much perpetrators as the men that they were being protected from. And because she'd grown up in a household where she had a very physically abusive mother, she understood that. And when she started to talk about this, she was actually ostracized from the shelter. She was no longer allowed to attend. She had death threats from people. And she was treated quite horribly to this day because she talked about the fact that violence can be bidirectional and that men and women commit violence at equal rates.
Right. So I've got one more question to put to you, Dr. Fiona, and for those folks in our audience who are interested to put a question to you, I've just got one more to make, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Daryl. But you said that you wanted to, quote, change the narrative on how we view women as good and all men as bad, and that true equality comes when everyone is treated the same. Not all women are victims, not all men are perpetrators, unquote. Does all this mean that we need to have a change of attitude about how we think that power should be used?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And I think the pendulum has swung to the point where it's gone too far the other way. But I think power is a great way to look at it because women have comparable power to men these days, not in every circumstance, but in some circumstances. So you need to look at the power dynamics. You think about the home, 50 years ago, mum was in the home raising the kids, dad was earning the income, mum was responsible for the home. These days you see, sometimes dad's at home raising the kids and mum's out earning an income. So things like financial control in the home is something that does give someone quite a extensive amount of power. And if that's something that they misuse, then that's something that should be looked at. It shouldn't just be assumed that gender plays. I mean, gender obviously plays a role. Men are physically stronger than women, so men are more likely to harm a woman over a woman harming a man. But I think it's those power dynamics we need to look at. We need to take the gender out. What's the behaviour that's going on? Who actually is in control? Who actually has the power? And I think we're going to see a lot bigger indicators of what's going to happen next. I think it gives us a much better picture of who's at risk and who's not, and who's at risk of being a perpetrator and who's at risk of being a victim. So I think it's something that definitely we need to think about. And we do need an attitude change. I don't know how we do that. I think that, we see at the moment the left being so aggressive and so nasty. I mean, look at the case of the gentleman that died recently in America, and speaking the
Charlie
word of
Kirk.
what's that? Charlie Kirk. Yes,
Charlie Kirk.
had a brain freeze. Charlie Kirk. Thank you, Charlie Kirk. And we saw people celebrating his death and laughing about it, and that's the kind of attitude that these people think is appropriate. And no one should ever celebrate someone's death, regardless of whether you agree with them or not. But that's that feminist mentality: is that you don't agree with me, then I want you dead. And I think that's a really horrible way to think in society. But yes, we definitely need some attitude change.
Well, thank you for opening up this subject for us. There's a lot for us to consider coming out of this. But right now, I'll turn over to my colleague Daryl Budge in Perth. Daryl, you have some questions for us to put to
First
Dr.
of all, I
Girkin.
had a very nice comment from Braun. She says, have heard of you through wonderful podcast Finding Gold in the Sludge and love the content of those episodes. So when I saw you
Thank
coming up on the Family
you.
Voice Zoom, she said
Thank you
she
so
had to
much.
listen. Thanks for shedding light on this topic. My husband experienced the stress of bullying in the workplace, resulting in him leaving. I really valued your insight, providing better understanding. So a couple of follow-up questions to that, I think, is bullying in the workplace has become quite common, but also bullying in schools as well. How can corporations and schools, I think, so it starts off quite early in life, a culture of bullying being somehow acceptable. And I guess social media very much feeds into that, the faceless engagement that we're allowed to have now. We can bully somebody anonymously or even without any physical contact whatsoever with the person. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and I think this is where we see high levels of female bullying, because female bullying is very transferable to the online space. You know, you see most of the online bullying that occurs comes from women toward women. So I think that's a big issue. I think that these women that behave badly as adults were children that behaved badly and were rewarded for that bad behavior, whether it was they got status with the group they hung out with at school or what. But it's that level of reward people get, and it's that social reward. You know, I did this to someone because, you know, she's this, and then they go online and they share it, or they share videos of hurting someone, and then it's celebrated. And I think that's the worst thing, is that as a society, you've got this underground of people who celebrate the hurting of others. And I just talked about Charlie Kirk. I mean, that's a good example. So I think that there's something serious that needs to be done, and people need to be calling that behavior out. But bullying does start, that addressing that bullying does start at school. Um, I think it's about learning to respect other people. I don't think we teach kids enough about respecting adults and respecting each other. I think we've moved down to a path of gender wars where, you know, men against women. You know, I've heard stories of schools overseas that have made boys stand up in front of the class and apologize to the girls simply for just being a boy, because they one day be a perpetrator. And that kind of behavior just creates this real gender divide. Because the thing is, we actually need men. We need good men to protect us women, from bad men, just as we need good, powerful women to protect us from bad women. So I think, you know, we need a balance of both, but I think there's not enough support for people to call it out. That bystander mentality. I think people need to step up, but people are scared, and I understand that. You know, certainly trying to stand up to a psychopath is very difficult, but just being able to stand up to others and saying, actually, I don't like how you treat that person. That's not okay. But I think there's a very broad social issue, and I think social media is really contributing to a lot of that, especially in young people.
Yeah, we just see the effect of the government imposed ban on social media for young people, whether or not that'll have a positive effect, or they'll just end up going in darker places and less known, less visible places of bullying.
Yeah, and I think it's great that they're trying to do that, but I think it's going to backfire. They're already seeing that kids are very smart, and they're already finding ways around it now. So yeah, I hope it does create a better system, but I think, yeah, the too much social media is not helping people at all.
Yeah. From a Family Voice perspective, obviously, as a Christian organisation, we're reflecting on that. Schools are disengaging kids from knowing who they are as people, that they're created in the image of God, and that every person is valuable and created in God's image. And so therefore, that's why we love and respect and honour every person for what they do that is right and righteous and things like that. So I think that's where kids are just, from a very young age, being taught in a very destructive way. Another question I have is, sorry, go on.
So I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the things they've taken out of school. Religion used to be taught in school, and those Christian moral values. And I think a move away from that in society. And I'm pleased to hear that there's a lot of young people coming back to the church, because it's those basic moral values of respect and care for each other is lost, is definitely been lost. And I think part of that's people moving away from religion.
Absolutely, yeah. So I have questions about we've talked about this earlier. Senator Malcolm Roberts grilled some researchers from the Australian Institute of Family Studies at Senate Estimates, and you said that you had a watch of that, and you've got a report coming about this particular line of questioning. He basically exposed this anti-male bias at the research institute that receives a whole lot of government funding and government support, and the government basically engages them to write a report with these specific terms of reference, and they take that with no questions asked and just write the report as the government desires. So what's your reflections on that? What are your findings?
Yeah, so I have a real issue with the way the government funds research into domestic violence in particular. We have a national plan that's to support women and children, but men aren't included in that. Everyone but men are included in that. I think that even research centres, they're all funded by the government. They all have that same agenda, that we need to protect women. And what happens is they leave out key data that should be included around men as victims. And their excuse in this conversation that Malcolm Roberts had with them, when he said, hang on, there was data that showed that men were experiencing high levels of violence and you left that out. And they said, oh, that wasn't our terms of reference. So I think the government manipulates the situation and manipulates the reports that are released. I used to work in state government in Tasmania, and I saw that happen, where reports would come out, where reports would be done, but the findings of the research weren't what the government needed. So the report was buried and no one was ever allowed to see it. And that's really common. So what they're doing is these institutions rely on this government money. So they have to give the government what they want to hear. And if the government is seen to be protecting women, that's what the flavour of the day is. That's what they're going to do. And they're going to leave out anything that jeopardises that narrative. And I think that that's a real biased way of looking at it. And it definitely isolates men. Men are too scared to speak up. As it is, from a masculine perspective, they're seen as weak if they do. But they're also not believed. I mean, I've got hundreds of emails from men that have said to me, I went to the police after my wife beat me black and blue, and I was charged as a perpetrator. And this is a really common thing because there's excuses made for women's violence. There's a number of studies on that. And so, yeah, I have written a report that will hopefully be out next week. It'll be on my website, but I'll also do a video on YouTube about it. And it's all about those hidden studies, those studies that have shown that violence between men and women has been fairly symmetrical for some time. And I'm talking 30 years. But there's a number of studies that people just aren't using or aren't referring to because they need to keep that narrative going. The other thing too is a lot of the research that's done is done interviewing participants who go to these feminist services for counselling. So you're only getting women's side of the story. You're only hearing from victims. No one's actually interviewing perpetrators. It's something I would love to do because you're only getting one side of the story. You're only getting one person's perception of the situation. And I think it's research that's not very balanced. And I think we need to do a lot more to balance it out. And I think we need to stop with the narrative that if we support men, we're not going to support women, which is not the case. They're not mutually exclusive. We need to be able to help everyone that's in need of support.
Absolutely. And we've got a minister for women, but no minister for men. We've got everything is very skewed in one particular direction.
Very.
Which is pretty awful. And so in follow-up to that, I think we basically need institutions to obviously review how they do it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, my mind went blank. I should have written down a note of what I've got to follow up your next question with, because what you're saying is so excellent. It's absolutely spot on. I think one of the biggest, I was going to talk about Marxism and just the underlying religious belief that has now evolved. So Marxism obviously agrees in this, it lives in this oppressor kind of narrative that there's always one class that's the oppressed and one other class of people that's always the oppressor, and they've got the very black and white definition of what those are, and there's no gray areas in between. And that's where we've kind of lived in this narrative. So when Malcolm Roberts questions these people from AEFS, you were saying earlier that basically how can you believe that questioning these victims, they must be absolutely believed there cannot be any other victims that are just as victimized, men in particular, because they have agreed with this Marxist narrative. So what are your reflections on this religious bias that's now evolved, where basically government is preaching its own religion of Marxism is the truth, you must believe this one narrative?
Yeah. And I think the problem with that is, as human beings, we're not sitting in the corner on our own interacting with ourselves. Every interaction we have with other people has an impact, whether that's positive or negative. And to assume that perpetrators of domestic violence, and the way we talk about men, that they are behaving in isolation is complete falsehood. You know, you only need to look at anything around psychology that talks about how we interact as human beings. So what I think we need to do is we need to look at the bigger system. And there's a researcher called Murray Strauss, who I talk about in my report, who did quite a bit of work around this. And he looked at you know, those interactions between two people. You know, was the woman the one that was pushing and shoving and being really, really nasty for years on end before he snapped and slapped her across the face. And not that that's okay in any way, shape or form,
Yeah.
but we need to understand the cause and effect. Otherwise, we're never going to fix the problem. You know, we keep throwing funding at the same thing over and over again, thinking it's going to fix it. Let's throw more money at counselling and support. Maybe we actually need to look at behaviour change programs that incorporate both parties, that are more of a couple approach. You know, if you're going to stay in the couple situation, find out how they deal with conflict. I mean, there's cases where, you know, a couple might be quite abusive, but when they split up and go with other partners, they mightn't be abusive at all. It may just be that the two personalities together are quite toxic and there's this real power interplay between the two. So I think unless we're willing to look at what causes it, there's a comedian that does a bit of a skit around domestic violence when he talks about the fact that, you know, when there's a fire, the fire brigade go in and sift through the rubble to see what happened and what caused it. But we don't do that with domestic violence. We just blame the perpetrator instead of going, hang on, what's actually happened here? And it's not about victim blaming, because I know that's probably what some people think, but I don't think it is, because to protect, there's studies that show that women will often instigate the violence. So if women are instigating the violence, whether that's through verbal abuse, physical abuse, whatever, if we can learn to help women better deal with conflict in relationships, we can actually reduce violence against women. So they're actually doing a disservice to women by not actually looking at how those interactions occur and how the violence got to what it did. So I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I'm hoping people like Malcolm Roberts, you know, continue to be willing to fight against the grain and go, hang on a minute, we need to look at this differently, because the definition is stupidity, isn't it? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. So I think there's more to be done.
Well, in addition to, of course, the family law court being quite, well, let's just say, believe whatever the victim says in any situation where we cannot have any kind of evidential cross-examination about any claim that's been made. It's just believed straight away. What's in addition to that, now we have coercive control being this newly defined area where it's gone from a particular legal definition to a very, very social definition of it. And it's taking a while for the government to grapple with how can we legally enforce this? What kind of penalties, both civil and criminal, can we apply to this? Have you done any research in this area, and what do you think its implications are for these kinds of women that can use it for a very negative purpose? I mean, this is going beyond corporate, going to the family situation, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, look, I think that coercive control is very subjective, and I think that it's easy to say that I felt manipulated, and it's hard to prove that. So this is the problem. You know, I've been watching Queensland and New South Wales in terms of since they've put these coercive control laws in. Tassie's had them for some time. It's come under emotional abuse. We just didn't call it coercive control. But New South Wales in particular are putting out reports every few months around the data. And I think the last time I looked at it was a couple of months ago, and it said that they had arrested over 500 people with coercive control charges, but they'd only actually prosecuted one and two others were in the court. And they actually had high-level detectives working on these cases because they couldn't prove coercive control existed or that it was one-sided. And I think, you know, I joke with my husband sometimes that, you know, some of the interactions we have, oh, that could be coercive control. You know, he might want something for dinner, so he might come and pat me on the shoulder. Oh, I'd love that for dinner. Is that coercive control? No, it's just, but you know, things like they talk about control over money. You know, you think about relationships where maybe one party's restricted from using the credit card. That party, say it's the woman, oh, he won't let me buy stuff on the credit card, you know, he's restricting my spending. Well, maybe you've got a spending problem. Maybe it's not simply that he's restricting you from spending money, but maybe you need that money to support your children or pay your mortgage. So I think we're not looking deep enough. We're just saying this is the restriction, or I'm feeling triggered, or I'm feeling psychologically abused. But I don't agree that anyone should be charged with coercive control alone unless it looks at other things. So I think it's just a new law to try and trap men, but I think what they'll find is that more women use coercive control than men ever did. So I think that's something they need to seriously think about, but they're not acknowledging that. They're saying it's men that do it, but yeah, women can be way more manipulative. I've got myself in trouble for saying that before, but I'll say it again because I'm a woman, I know.
And so thankfully in that respect, I guess it's not something that the family law court is dealing with very much yet in terms of accusation being made, and coercive control then becomes a factor in the court regards to separation.
Yeah.
But so obviously it's good that there is a higher bar that must be met in these criminal cases.
Yes, and I think I agree. I think that's a good thing. I think what bothers me is that it is clogging up the legal system for more important crimes. And I think that we need to look at better ways of dealing with domestic violence, and stop using outlier cases to justify laws when they're one-off cases that we may never see again. So yeah, I think a lot needs to change, but there's certainly some technology coming out in the AI space that can look at people's interactions and make determinations without emotion in them that will be interesting in the future.
That'd be interesting. It sounds very dangerous, actually.
It does a little bit. I've been contacted by an AI company who want me to analyze the outcomes of that data to make sure it's not turning into a psychopath. So we'll see how that goes.
Right, indeed. And I think some AI can very easily be, by the right line of questions, can be turned into a psychopath. So
yes,
anyway,
definitely.
so ends my questioning, Andrew, and thanks very much for your time, Fiona.
Thanks, Daryl.
If anybody else has any more questions to ask, please ask them right now. Otherwise, we'll end up finishing up now-ish.
Well, thank you, Dr. Girkin, for sharing what you have on our subject, when feminism turns toxic. Would you like to bring some concluding comments to our session today?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I guess what I'll say is I think it's really important to understand when people behave badly so that we can help people do better. I also don't think that all women are toxic in any way, or nor are all feminists. And I know plenty of feminists who aren't toxic. I think it's when the behavior gets to the point where it hurts others and people are laughing about harm to others that I think that's when it becomes a real problem. I also think that it's important for people to protect themselves. So if you've got someone in your life or someone in your workplace that is causing you psychological harm, then please seek help for that. But also remember that, you need to find a way out if it is causing you more harm than good. But there is definitely help out there for people, and I certainly have some resources on my website to help people if they need it. So,
what is your website?
It's www.drfionagirkin.com.
Great.
Very simple.
Yeah.
Well, once again, thanks again for turning up and being a part of our session today. This has been helpful,
Thanks for having me.
I'm sure, for lots of people, and we wish you God's blessing in your future work.
Thank you, and God bless you all.